we inform.
Religious freedom is about people of faith being able to live out their faith, live out their convictions, no matter where they are.
We equip.
Sacred honor is the courage to speak truth, to live out your free speech.
We also rejoice in our sufferings because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope.
This is At the Core on American Family Radio.
Welcome to At the Core with Mark Wildmon and Rick Green. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution Coach. Thanks so much for joining me today. I've got I think a timely lesson for us this week. You know, listen, you're watching all of these presidential, I can't even really call them nominations yet because he won't actually nominate these folks until January 20th when he takes office, but he's letting it be known. And I love the way he's wording, actually, President Trump is wording these announcements where he's saying so-and-so will serve as, so he's assuming that they will be approved by the Senate if it requires approval. But I just think there's so much of this going on that we might need a refresher on essentially the constitutional duties and responsibilities of the president when it comes to the executive branch and these executive branch appointees, the Senate when it comes to the approval process, all this talk about recess appointments. I mean, there's just a lot to dive into that we haven't been able to cover in a while. So we're going to jump into that today, and we'll be jumping into Constitutional Live. That's, of course, our entire course on the Constitution, and I'll just be using the section on the presidency, and we may even throw in a little bit about the Electoral College, so we can always learn more about that. It's vital that we keep the Electoral College, do not allow this national popular vote movement to take over. Otherwise, you will rarely, if ever, elect a president that is elected by the whole country. The big cities will do it. And you could just look at that map, those very, very few areas that are blue on the map, the big cities, they would dominate. And all of those other 3,000 and some odd counties around the country that are red would have to deal with a presidency of someone only elected by the city. So we'll get further into that most likely either today or Thursday, because I'm going to spend both of my programs this week talking about this. But it is vitally important to know how the Electoral College works. But it's also very important to know just how the president's role works. And so you've heard about some of these appointees. Man, I got to just start with Kash Patel and the FBI. This is, you've heard how excited I've been about some of these nominees. All right, there's some really stellar nominations out there. The level of Christmas every day right now is off the charts. I mean, yes, there's been a few that haven't been great. The Surgeon General, terrible one, but for the most part, 95% have been absolutely incredible. It reminds me, actually, in Trump's first term, I was not that thrilled with his nominations to a lot of these positions for, FBI and CIA and Secretary of all these different departments. But I was super thrilled with his judicial appointments. His judicial nominations turned out to be 95% outstanding. And so I'm feeling that way now about these key positions that are really going to determine whether or not we can drain the swamp. Will we actually root out the deep state and reset the table to rein in the federal government? There's a lot of great rhetoric right now to that end. If you just listen to Vivek Ramaswamy or Elon Musk or Tom Homan or obviously President Trump himself or J.D. Vance, you listen to the rhetoric of what these guys are saying, and it looks really, really good for a resetting of the table. For everything that we've been talking about and working towards for decades, this could be the moment that we make it happen. But it's only rhetoric until it gets done. It only gets done if you have people in place that support the president's agenda and will actually do the things that he campaigned upon. And so far, it looks really good for making that happen. Now, there's going to be a lot of discussion here on At the Core as this happens. For instance, with RFK being in Health and Human Services, that's great. And he's absolutely going to take it to the deep state when it comes to, what the CDC, Center for Dementia Confusion, and the NIH and all these different agencies have done. He's going to counter all of that. But there is a tendency on his part to lean towards government solutions. So they're already floating out this idea of, what ingredients can be used for sugar. And what really needs to happen is government needs to stop doing subsidies for corn and all of these, what ends up being these syrups that are very unhealthy for all of us. If government would stop subsidizing all that stuff and stop limiting imports on sugar and that sort of thing, then you would see the market balance that out, and people would want healthier things and demand it. But you have to get the friction out of the market where the government is controlling those things. Now, there is a time for government to say something is so bad and so unhealthy and dangerous to the point of we don't want that in our backyard. Cocaine, for instance, fentanyl, those kind of things. There is an extreme where the government should say no to that thing even being allowed or existing. But most of the time, it should be the market, or it should be the states and the local governments and not federal government. So we'll be monitoring this. We'll be commenting on this as it's happening. But the right people are in place to move in the right direction. And oh my, does Kash Patel fit that bill? I mean, look, folks, Tulsi Gabbard being the national security advisor and now going to be in charge of the agencies that deemed her a terrorist is just fun. And a shot across the bow. Kash Patel fits that maybe even more so because they hate him. These intelligence agencies hate him. The FBI hates him. He has been the one to call them out on so many occasions. It is so bad. They are whining like crazy. I am loving it. I am so enjoying the meltdown of the leftist media and the deep state, deep state Republicans, guys like John Bolton that has now compared Kash Patel to these, horrible, Stalin era Russian guys. It's so obvious that they know that the jig's up. The scam is up. The people that Trump is putting in place they're going to totally upset the apple cart. They're turning it over. They're turning over the tables, folks. Fashion the whip, turn over the tables. We're about to restore the House, and I couldn't be more excited. So pay close attention on the Kash Patel thing. That's going to be a huge and going to tell us a lot about the follow through on what Donald Trump is going to be doing in this new agency, and just enjoy the squealing and the whining and the wringing of the hands of the left, because that tells you right there when you see them to respond to a nomination like this, that tells you that it's a good nomination. And that one will probably be hard fought, but I think he'll definitely get approved. It's not going to end up being the Matt Gaetz thing, I don't think. All right, so I'm gonna chunk up a little bit out of these specific nominations into the process, because we all need to know how this thing works. As I pointed out a couple of weeks ago, I am not a fan of this recess appointment thing that the Trump administration is throwing out. This audio you're going to hear from the videos of Constitution Alive, my full Constitution class taught in Independence Hall and in David Barton's library. I talk about this, the recess appointments. This was 12 years ago when I recorded that part of Constitution Alive, and I remain, on the side of saying that you should not abuse the recess appointment process. You should not skirt around the Senate doing their job. And as I mentioned a couple weeks ago, I get it. We're at war. We're in a culture war. The other side has done all kinds of things, and we have to fight fire with fire and all that. But we also still have to maintain the Constitution. And so I do not like the idea of sliding in recess appointments or trying to make this thing where they recess. There is a mechanism where this could be done. I don't know that it's ever been done. It is different from the president just sliding in the appointments while the Senate goes home for the weekend. That's what I complain about in what you're about to hear, and what I think was abused by both Republicans and Democrats. But that's not really the technique that the Trump campaign is talking about using. They're talking about using a clause in the Constitution where if the two houses cannot agree on an adjournment, then one of them their disagreement can basically be made publicly through their separate resolutions on when to adjourn, or only one of them having a resolution to adjourn, and then the president can recess them when there's a disagreement like that. And so in order for Trump to do this, the House would have to go along with it, which means, and Speaker Johnson probably would. I think you're seeing him really team up with President Trump right now. I just don't know if they can get the votes when we're going to be at a 2 or 3 vote majority. So I don't know. It's an interesting idea. It does allow the Trump administration to hit the ground running, which I do like that idea. I mean, they've got 2 years, not 4. They've got 2, because there's every real possibility that Republicans lose the House in 2 years. That's just typically what happens in a midterm election. The president usually loses seats in that midterm election. And so obviously with only 3 to lose, there's a very decent chance Republicans lose the House in 2026. So that's why it's so important for the Trump administration and the Republicans to press the gas, get everything done in these 2 years that they possibly can. And so I totally understand them trying to find ways constitutionally to not allow for a minority the Democrats in the Senate to filibuster and stop these appointments from taking place, because they're going to try to hamstring Trump. You know they are. They're going to do everything they can to prevent that. I think there are other ways to do it. I mentioned it on the air a couple of weeks ago, possibly even appointing some of these guys to assistant secretary and not requiring Senate approval, and just don't appoint anybody to the top position until you can finally get them through, and then let that assistant be acting and take care of business until the Senate gets out of the way or approves somebody. So we'll see what happens. I'm going to jump in right now to Constitutional Live. This is Section 6 in Constitutional Live, where we cover the presidency. So we're going to learn about more than recess appointments. We're going to learn about executive orders. We're going to learn about the Electoral College. We're going to learn about a lot of these things and some of the history on the presidency itself. So let's jump in. This is Section 6 of Constitutional Live. You can get the whole course, by the way, at patriotacademy.com. It's free. Sign up as a coach. You get not only Constitutional Live, you get Biblical Citizenship in Modern America, you get Constitutional Defense, your Family of Freedom, you get Kirk Cameron's American Campfire Revival. I mean, there's a ton of good stuff in there. Just go to patriotacademy.com, sign up as a coach, and you get all of these videos for free. All right, here's Constitutional Live with David Barton and Rick Green. Welcome back to Constitutional Live with David Barton and Rick Green. We've been talking about the Congress in the last couple of sections, and now we're going to start diving into the presidency.
But before we do that, I want to back up. In the last lesson, you talked about science and promoting useful art.
Yeah.
Read that clause out of the Constitution.
All right, let's. This is our workbook. So this is promoting the progress, right, is the section we want to go to. So in Article 1, Section 8, to promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing for a limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries.
Now, that's an interesting clause. If I tell you the word Noah Webster or Webster, what do you think of?
The dictionary.
Exactly.
Yes.
You don't think of a founding father. Noah Webster's responsible for that clause in the Constitution.
So he actually had influence on the Constitution.
He had huge influence. As a matter of fact, he's the second guy in America to call for the Constitutional Convention. Peloton Webster was first, and Noah Webster was second.
Really?
And he's the second guy to call for it, and then he did that in 1785. Then they assembled 1787 to do it. He has direct influence. He met with all sorts of the delegates, met with George Washington, had dinner with him, all these different guys.
He was like a lobbyist.
He was like a lobbyist.
A lobbyist for the Constitution. Now, he wasn't a scientist, was he? I don't know much about the things that he did.
Noah Webster actually was a scientist.
Was he?
I mean, he's probably one of the top 3 educators in American history. And his deal was, all right, now that we've separated from Great Britain, if we don't educate American-wise, we're going to still think like British citizens, because what happened, we were still importing textbooks from Great Britain. And so our literature books, our grammar books, our spelling books, our history books, our government books all come from Great Britain. He said, no, we'll start thinking like British people rather than Americans. So he called for a revolution in education to match the revolution we'd had in our forms of government.
Yeah.
And so he starts writing textbooks like crazy. And he's writing textbooks, and so he's very active as a founding father himself. He was a soldier in the Revolution. He was a legislator. He was a judge. Actually, it was a legislator in 2 states after the Revolution, judge. So he's very much politically involved, but he understands how important education is. He wrote textbooks on meteorology, on animal husbandry, on economics, one of the best economic books out there, Noah Webster did, on medicine, one of the best layman's medicine books ever done. He wrote books on science, on government, on you name the subject. I mean, he probably wrote more textbooks than anybody in America on every area.
So he understood the importance of protecting your creation, what you've written, what you put on the market.
And by the way, after the Constitutional Convention was over, the Founding Fathers went to him and asked him to promote it and write pieces, and so he did. He's a big read, kind of like the Federalist Papers. He writes these pieces that went across the nation, were highly read by people, and why they should ratify the Constitution.
No kidding, I didn't know that.
So he's a big influence. But that part right there is the result of this book right here. Now this, I don't know if this is going to be good news or bad news. This is a spelling book. He came out with a spelling book in 1782.
One of his creations.
Noah Webster's spelling book. And remember, he wants us to be different from the British. So until this book came out in 1782, there was not a right way or a wrong way to spell a word in America. And that's why folks like John Trumbull, colonial governor, spelled his own last name 6 different ways. I have letters here, Rick, in this library, and if you'll read them phonetically, you say, that guy's from Georgia. Oh, he's from Boston. Because
these were his own way of, he spelled it different ways.
Everybody did in America. Yeah. So I've got a letter over there where it talks about D-A-A-W-G. Oh, dog. And if you can read it that way. Yeah. And so I got letters from John Jay, the Chief Justice, that are very much on the Maine, Boston kind of accent side.
All right, quick break, everybody. We'll be right back. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution Coach. You're listening to Constitutional Live as we're learning about the presidency, just as we're preparing for all these executive orders and appointments and everything else that we're dealing with right now. So we'll be right back. Stay with us. You're listening to At the Core with Wildmon and Rick Green.
So let's just stop here and say the most important thing that you can do to protect your child online, the first thing that you should do is to pray for them. Pray for them every day, multiple times a day, and pray that God would protect them.
The Dr. Nurse Mama Show. For more from Dr. Jessica Peck, tune in at 2 p.m. Central on American Family Radio or on the podcast page at afr.net.
If God could speak, what would he say?
The Bible subjects itself to historical verification.
He says, we saw this.
We go to the Bible wanting to hear what the living God has to say to us.
When God speaks, what does he say?
The God Who Speaks. Visit thegodwhospeaks.org.
How much control, unfortunately, the executive office does have to direct a lot of these procedures in terms of amnesty, what they can do, even though Congress needs to step it up, and we know constitutionally they should be making sure that the law reflects the American position, but law enforcement is the executive branch, and if you're not enforcing the law, then the law is merely just on paper.
Jenna Ellis in the morning, weekdays at 7 Central on American Family Radio.
There have been people in our nation who have been pining for wickedness. As we read through Romans 1, you see over and over, God gave them over. God gave them over. But what is happening is evidence of abandonment. We need to understand that that is included within the wheelhouse, if you will, of God judging a people.
Join Abraham Hamilton III on the Hamilton Corner, weekdays at 5 p.m. Central on AFR. At the Core podcasts are available at afr.net. Now, back to At the Core on American Family Radio.
We're back here on At the Core with Walker Wildmon and Rick Green. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution coach, and we are working on learning about the presidency as we get ready for a new administration. And already there's a lot of talk about recess appointments and about executive orders and all these different things. And so we as citizens have to understand what those proper jurisdictions are. Who gets to do what? And who's got the authority to do what? How do we do this in a constitutional way? And how do we reset the boundaries in Washington, D.C. back to what the Constitution designed for it to be? And in order to do that, we got to have constitutional literacy. We got to have civic literacy. And so that's why we're walking through Constitutional Live, which is our Constitution class we do at Patriot Academy and Wall Builders. David Barton and I did it several years ago. And so what you've been listening to in the first segment, and we'll listen to the rest of today, and also on Thursday we'll get a little bit more, is Constitutional Live Section 6, which covers the presidency. And so we're talking about some of the history of how this was set up, and then we'll better understand what the original intent was on how this thing should work. So let's jump right back in. As we were going to break, David was talking about how these letters have these different, you can even tell the accents and the different language of how the different parts of the country talked. And sometimes that has bearing on the meaning of certain words that they use. So anyway, we'll jump right back in. Here's where we left off with Constitutional Live with David Barton and Rick Green.
I got letters from John Jay, the Chief Justice, that are very much on the Maine, Boston kind of accent side. They had R's after their A's in the words. They drop A's out. They pock the con, the yod.
Wow.
So you can literally read. And he's the guy who came out and said, no. And he...
I can't imagine. I'm sorry. I was just thinking about him writing from, from Virginia to Boston or wherever, and the difference in those letters, even in the committees of correspondence. I never thought about that. So there was probably...
There was no standard for spelling until this comes out. And then he says, and we're not spelling it the way the British do. And so the British, when they spell labor, L-A-B-O-U-R, he dropped out all the U's out of words, and favor, F-A-V-O-U-R. So this is the deal. But now, this is his creation. You can't get it copyrighted in America because we're 13 states, and you got to go to every state.
You got to go to each one.
You got to go to every state. So I can get this copyrighted in Massachusetts, but North Carolina doesn't like me. Or I can get this copyrighted up in Vermont, but you know what? New York doesn't like. And so how do you protect your creation? This is your property. Founding Fathers taught that this type of stuff, your intellectual property is as much your property as your real estate, as much as your money, anything else. And so he's the guy who got that part added. And again, read it again. Listen to what and think about this.
And he must have thought that the Commerce Clause alone was not enough. So the Commerce Clause was to make sure that all 13 states, that you had that free flow of commerce. But that doesn't give you protection. But it doesn't protect.
It lets him sell his books everywhere, but it doesn't protect his property.
So this was specifically to promote promote the progress of science and useful arts by securing, so you're protecting that property for limited times to authors and inventors the exclusive right to their respective writings and discoveries. So he wasn't asking, like we talked about in that last chapter, he wasn't asking Congress or the federal government to pay for it.
No.
He wasn't asking for them to
protect my private
just
property.
protect it. Don't promote it by spending money to promote it. Just protect it.
That's right.
When somebody else tries
I'll
to
promote it. I'll
it.
buy the ads in the newspaper. We got newspapers in here where he's selling this
where he's
book.
actually advertising this selling book. Wow.
He'll buy the ads, etc. And this did real well. More than 100 million copies over the life of from 1782 to 1932. But he promoted himself. 100 million copies. That's how come. And I don't know. Maybe he's a hero. Maybe he's a heel. If you don't like spelling, he's a heel. If you like spelling, but he's the guy.
I just appreciate. One time we did a television show together, and you broke out some spelling tests from back then and made me try to spell them on. So I just want to thank you for not doing that here. Well, no, I'm not even going to try.
I could let you try some of these spelling words.
You.
And by the way, this is an elementary spelling book. It's embarrassing.
Yeah.
I don't even try to pronounce
I can't pronounce them, let alone spell them. No doubt about it.
It's no question. So,
all right, great point though, because that, again, it's back to original intent.
It is.
Because I didn't even know that was the origin of it. I didn't know who it was, and I didn't know that it was for him. It was specifically dealing with authorship and books. But I'm sure he and Franklin, I can only imagine, they had to have discussions about science as well.
Well, you bet.
What a great,
but it's interesting. Franklin, the founding fathers had an attitude that you serve, and therefore they believed that if someone came to you and said, you've got to run for office, you're not allowed to say no, because that's selfish. Wow. If they've recognized that you're a leader and say, I want you in the legislature, if you say, no, I got to spend time with my family or my job, that's being selfish.
Wow.
And so Benjamin Rush specifically quotes Romans 14:7 out of the Bible to say, no man lives and dies to himself. It's not your choice. You're here to serve other people.
Yeah.
And so that was their belief. And so Franklin, with all his inventions, never patented a single one.
Wow.
Because he believed that they all belonged to the public. He wanted to do it to help people. And so, he could have been wealthy in a lot of ways. No, he invented all these cool things and didn't patent any, but others did. It's a private property. They have the right to do that.
And so he obviously supported protecting their property.
He's at the convention, and he supports Webster. Webster met with Franklin, and Franklin and Webster had discussions on spelling and other books. So it's part of it. And the other thing from the last lesson that we talked about duty, and the question was, well, if God's in charge of everything, why do we need to get involved? And there's a really cool thing that I thought of that I pulled out. This is an election sermon, and probably folks don't know what an election sermon is.
Yeah, we don't get many of those anymore.
And we think it's a sermon on election, but not really. For 170 years, this is a sermon that was preached in front. We started state legislative assemblies by having a joint session of legislature, House and the Senate, governor, lieutenant governor, and a minister preach a sermon to them.
Oh, so this is after the election.
This is after the election.
This is not a sermon about the election coming up. This is after the election.
This is after the election.
Having a sermon with those who actually got elected.
That's right. And so this happened in Hartford. So this is Connecticut. Matthias Burnett is the guy who did the sermon. And 1801, my recollection, I think the governor at that time was John Trumbull. And he was one of Washington's aide-de-camps in the Revolution. So we have some John Trumbull stuff back
He's got
there.
a statue at the Capitol, right?
Well, no, it's his dad that's got a statue.
Oh, that's his dad.
He's the son.
So that's the other Jonathan.
His
all
dad,
these Jonathan Troubles, I get confused.
It's like George Foreman.
Right.
All of his kids were named John.
Call
so
them all
John
to dinner
Trumbull.
at once
That's right.
with John, yeah.
So what you have is in this sermon, and he talks to the legislators about the issues they're facing, because the Bible gives guidance on every issue, economic issue, education, military, whatever. And he gets done with that, and then he looks up to all the citizens sitting in the balcony, because this is all the new elected officials down here. And so there's citizens just filling the gallery up there. And what he says to them, I find really profound. Now he's talking to the citizens, and he said, to God and posterity, you're accountable for your rights and your rulers. Now, a whole lot of Americans, they say, whoa, don't you blame those rulers on me? I didn't even vote last election.
Exactly. No doubt.
He said, you will answer to God for these rulers right here, and you will answer to your kids as well.
That's what I was going to say. Posterity is not a word that's used very often. No. He's saying you're actually responsible for the current leaders, because the future generations are going to pay the price for what you elect.
Now, this goes to eschatology, and it deals with people of faith understand this. It's a view of what they think is going to happen in the last days.
Yeah.
And so, if they think Christ is going to return in the last days, whatever, they're just sitting around, too many are just sitting around waiting for that. The point with that is, you know what, regardless of what eschatology you hold, you're still told specifically in the Scriptures, Luke 19:13, Jesus said, you occupy till I come. So the stewardship was there. If you think Christ is going to return today, great, but you be a steward till that time. So there's no checking out and saying, I don't have a duty, I'm waiting for
whether it's tomorrow or 50 years from now, today I do my duty.
And that's why, and these guys believe that. They definitely believe theologically Christ's return, but they also believe that if he didn't come when I want to, what I would do with posterity. And so that's why he said to God and posterity, you're accountable for your righteousness. Let's say that the end doesn't come when I think it's going to come. And so far, every generation since Christ was here thought it'd be in their generation. They've all been wrong.
Yeah.
He says, let not your children have reason to curse you for giving up those rights and prostrating those institutions which your fathers delivered to you as a sacred palladium, and which by the blessing of God have been peculiarly beneficial to your order, peace, and stability. He said, you'll answer to God, but you'll also answer the next generation. Don't let them curse you for having given up all these great rights we were entrusted. And that's, the Founding Fathers believe that. John Adams, he said, posterity, you'll never know how much it cost my generation to preserve your freedom. Don't make me repent in heaven that I did what I did. You know, It's like, don't you make me sorry that I worked so hard to give you something.
That's a serious, I started to say burden, but it is. It should be. It should be a burden. We should see that and say, hey, I've got a duty here that I need to be thinking about. I need to be investing in. So if you're going to do that right, if you're going to really do your children right and grandchildren right, you got to spend a little bit of time while we're studying all these things, but then study the candidates, know how they measure to these things.
That's right.
Invest in these things and fulfill that responsibility.
You know, studying the candidates probably take you a good 15 minutes every 2 years.
Plenty of tools out there now.
I don't know if I got 15 minutes to look at a voter's guide or search the internet, or, you know, that's just too much time. And see, that's the attitude that's going to keep us in trouble.
It is.
And if we don't get an attitude that says, you know what, it may take me 2 hours, but that's better than watching a TV program for 2 hours if I can save my country.
Yeah.
And that's the attitude we're going to have to.
And 10 years ago, it was even more difficult because you didn't have as many voter guides. There weren't all these groups out there doing the research.
That's right.
Today, you can spend 15 minutes on the internet, find those voter guides, look at all those candidates. Well, one of those areas that we need to hold accountable is a president. So every 4 years, we choose a president, and we're going to choose someone that's going to have an impact on us in so many different ways. So let's get into that area of the presidency.
Let's go back to what we saw earlier, and that is look at how the Constitution is laid out. Article 1, 2, and 3.
Kind of taking that step back again to see how the presidency fits into the whole thing.
Right.
Okay.
That's the second most important area. Congress is number one area, President's number two, and probably the most significant part of the presidential responsibilities is in Article 2, where it says to take care that the law shall be faithfully executed.
Yeah.
That's why he's called the executive branch. He executes the laws. So the laws that have been passed by Congress and signed by the President for however many years, his purpose is to execute those laws. Now, when we do that, John Adams says, when you execute the laws as passed constitutionally, he had a great quote. He said, we're a government of laws and not of men. It doesn't matter who gets in office because you're bound by the laws that are there. But knowing human nature as they did, and the way they set up guards against it, they also pointed out that it's going to be really easy for somebody to get in and try to run their own agenda through the executive branch.
Yeah.
And so he talked about it. This is what he said. He said, the interest of the people is one thing. It is the public interest. In other words, for the people, they want what's good for the people. They're not interested in agendas of different groups. The people have a public interest. He said, and where the public interest governs, it's a government of laws and not of men. When you're looking out for the good of the people themselves, you'll do what the laws say, not what you yourself say. You may have a different agenda, you may get elected on an agenda, but when you're looking out for the good of the people, you're going to uphold the laws that the people's representatives that they chose have passed, whether you agree with the law or not.
Yeah.
So that's let me read it again. The interest of the people is one thing, it's the public interest. And where the public interest governs, it's a government of laws and not of men. But he said, however, the interest of a king or a party or a president is another thing. It is a private interest. And where private interest governs, it's a government of men and not of laws. If you elect a president who says, I'm going to take my pen and just rewrite what I want through executive orders, I'm going to use agencies to get what I want, I've got an agenda, I was elected with an agenda, and I'm going to cram that agenda through, it's no longer a government of laws, it's now a government of men. Because that man is the small end of the funnel, he is deciding everything that the people need. It's not what the representatives say they need, I'll tell you what they need.
And that's ignoring the laws
That's ignoring the laws.
Yeah.
And so that's why the most important responsibility for any president is to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. He's the guardian. He has a trust from previous generations, all the laws they passed. The War Powers Act goes back in the 1930s, but you know what? It's still on the books. And that means all the people for the last 70, 80 years want that law there. And so he keeps enforcing it because that may not be what he personally wants. That's what America's wanted and kept for 80 years. And so whatever the law is, he's got to uphold that law.
And I guess it applies to the Constitution itself as well, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's still the laws of the people.
That's
what we've put in place. So he has to faithfully execute the laws. as the Constitution says that it should be
That's
done.
right. And I may not like freedom of the press if they attack me, but it doesn't matter. I've still got to uphold it. You know, I may not like freedom of conscience if you do something I don't agree with. That's all right. I still got to uphold it. And so that's what you look for in your public officials, people who put themselves to the side and say, I'm not the most important thing, you guys are. And this is what you've said. You've spoken with a collective voice, and I'm going to enforce your will. Now, there are occasions where that one thing here or one thing there you may have a conscience problem with. You know, Abraham Lincoln ignored the Supreme Court and Dred Scott decision because he did declare freedom for slaves in Washington, D.C., and the Supreme Court said you can't do that. You certainly have Thomas Jefferson with the Alien Sedition Act, says that's an absolutely bad law. I'm going to release everyone that was convicted under it, and they eventually repealed the law.
Yeah. But he did it in a constitutional way by pardoning or commuting.
That's right. He did it the right way, and he wasn't going in with his own agenda.
Yeah.
And so when you go into your own agenda and say, I'm going to use all these agencies and I'm going to use every tool I have to get done what I want, so what you want is a government of laws, not of men, and that's where the president comes in. He'll be the one, more than any other entity in government, to decide whether it's a government of laws or a government of men by what he chooses to enforce and not enforce.
So to choose those presidents wisely, we've got to know what their proper role is and how they should be following the Constitution and what they do. That's how we can hold them accountable. So to learn more about Article 2 in the presidency, we're going to go back out to Philadelphia at Independence Hall. Welcome back to Constitutional Live. We're going to do a quick review of what we covered last night. We had a great time here at Independence Hall. Wonderful class here with us. We covered a lot of ground, so I just wanted to do a quick review of what we did last night, and then we'll jump into our new section. Of course, last night we talked about our purpose, what this class is all about. We're the quick start guide to the Constitution. We're not doing the year-long class. We're not doing the 3-year law degree. We're just doing the quick start guide so that we know where to plug things in. We know how to be active as citizens to participate in our government. So we went through a quote by this guy. Who remembers who we were talking about? Who's this guy on the screen? Help me out. Anybody? I heard it in the back. You got it. John Jay, exactly. First Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, one of those authors of the Federalist Papers. And here's the quote that drove everything we did last night, and it will again tonight as well. He said, every member of the state, so that's all of us, ought diligently to read and to study. Again, remember that what we talked about was the study part means we're going to crack open the minds of the Founding Fathers. We're going to get inside there and find out what were they thinking, what did they intend, what were these guys actually trying to do with the words they put into the Declaration and the Constitution. So read and study the Constitution, and then teach the rising generation to be free. I love that phrase, that idea of passing the torch of freedom to the next generation, making sure that they get it as well. It's not enough for us to study it. We got to pass it intact to the next generation. By knowing their rights, they'll sooner perceive when they've been violated and be the better prepared to defend and assert them. So our purpose is to know our rights, know what these guys were putting in place for us, and then know how we're to constitutionally properly defend and assert them. That will drive everything that we do. And so we spent a little time last night talking about the seeds of liberty, what these guys in this room actually put into those documents that caused us to be the most successful nation in history. I told you last night, coming in here reminds me of National Treasures and Nicolas Cage coming in here and finding the glasses and the secret message on the back of the Declaration. And obviously we're not going to have anything like that happen, but we are going to be reminded and restore that message on the front side of the Declaration and the Constitution. Those words given to the world really defining our secret sauce, our formula for the future of our nation. And it worked incredibly well. The seeds that they planted gave us the most successful nation ever. We talked, or at least the kids came up and explained those 4 principles out of the Declaration. The idea that there are truths, there are concepts of right and wrong, that these guys were willing to pledge their lives, fortunes, and sacred honor. They wouldn't do that for just anything. They did it because they believed in right and wrong, moral absolutes, and a set of values, a set of ideas that was worth fighting and dying for.
Quick break, everybody. We'll be right back with more of Constitutional Live for you to hear on At the Core with Walker Wildmon and Rick Green.
I started playing basketball at 9 years old. I ended up having teammates that were my teammates all the way up through high school. And the Lord began to challenge me. Abe, you're a Christian, but have you ever shared the gospel with your teammates? I began to realize, no, I hadn't. What I'm saying is that God moved me to be concerned beyond me. It is impossible for you to be truly born again, yet you remain unconcerned about the people around you.
Tune in to the Hamilton Corner, weekdays at 5 p.m. Central on American Family Radio.
Whether it's a story about prayer in public schools or battles for biblical truth within our denominations, the American Family News Network is here to tell you what the newsmakers are saying.
We are starting to see a rebellion against corporate America's endorsement, coddling of the LGBTQ agenda.
The American Family News Network is comprised of news anchors and editors that team up to bring you news from a Christian perspective.
A TRO, for non-legal types out there, is basically just an emergency order that would have allowed Liam to go back to school wearing the t-shirt he wants to wear. And again, that t-shirt says there are two genders.
Not only can you listen to reports on the radio, but you can also visit afn.net for coverage of the latest headlines.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis out on the campaign trail was ready with an answer on the meaning of the word woke.
American Family News, reporters you can trust.
How do you deal with it when the person that you're caring for doesn't show gratitude? We're not in bondage to other people's gratitude. He came with no thought of our gratitude. He loved us while we were enemies. Who are we to withhold that which was given so lavishly to us?
Join Peter Rosenberger on Hope for the Caregiver, Saturdays at 7 a.m. and Sundays at 10 p.m. Central on American Family Radio.
At the Core podcasts are available at afr.net. Now, back to At the Core on American Family Radio.
We're back here on At the Core with Walker Wildmon and Rick Green. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution Coach. Let's jump right back in with Constitution Alive. We're learning about the presidency, getting some of this down. I'm telling you, the At the Core audience, you're going to learn more and know more than 99.9% of citizens out there. So when all this stuff starts happening in the next few weeks or in the first few weeks of January, you're going to know why they're opening the Electoral College ballots the way they are. You're going to know how these appointments should take place. You're going to know about the executive orders that are all going to take place that January 20th at noon, or should I say 12:01 maybe. Anyway, let's jump right back in. Here's Constitution Alive with David Barton and Rick Green.
And I mentioned last night that quote from George Washington. It comes from this speech right here. It's his farewell address. This is actually a 1796 printing of that address. It's an old book. And I want to just read directly out of the book for you if I can. It's tough, that old English and the way they did the S's and all that, but let's see if I can get it right for you. He said, of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness. The firmest props of the duties of men and citizens, the mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and cherish them. A volume could not trace all their connections with private and public felicity. In other words, he was saying that religion and morality were connected to both our private happiness and our public happiness. For our nation to be successful, it was connected to that. Let it be firmly asked, where is the security for property, for reputation, for life, if the sense of religious obligation desert the oaths, which are the instruments of investigation in courts of justice? He's saying if you don't have that private expectation that I'm going to be held accountable to a higher being, then when you take an oath in court, for instance, you got no reason to tell the truth. Why would you tell the truth if nobody else there would know? That oath means nothing without that belief in God, without that belief that there's somebody that's going to hold me accountable outside of just this group in the room. So he goes on to talk about the importance in religion and education. I just think it's so neat to bring these guys, bring their actual words from over 200 years ago and be reminded of what they gave us. We also talked about the fact that they did believe that there was a higher being, that that's the source of our freedom, that we don't give it to each other, that we don't get it from government, it comes from God, and therefore government can't take it away. We can't take it from each other. Very important concept. And then we talk about the consent of the governed, the idea that the only just power of government comes from us. It comes from you, it comes from me. We've got to be engaged giving or refusing that consent. And lastly, Rhett talked about the pursuit of happiness, that free enterprise system that's so important to our system of government. Then we went into kind of stepping back and saying, what's the 30,000 feet view? And you remember how quickly we flew through the entire Constitution just to get a big picture of what it's all about. We covered the 7 articles. We covered the 27 amendments, and we just flew through all of them, skipped over the Bill of Rights, which we'll get to tonight, but it gave us a big picture. And then we zoomed in the last part of our class to the enumerated powers of Congress, what the dues of Congress actually are. And we found those in Article 1, Section 8, and spent our time on Article 1, Section 8 to identify those important dues of Congress, those enumerated powers. Tonight, what we want to do is we want to dive in now to Article 2. We want to step in and see what was the executive branch designed to do. What's the proper function of the presidency in our nation? We're not going to be able to cover every little thing in our quick start guide, so I've tried to pick out some of the hot topics, if you will, or the things that have been in the news lately and the things that we're most concerned about with regard to the executive branch. So we're going to jump into the presidency, and a lot of things we could talk about. Not going to go through much of the details in terms of 2 terms and you know, a lot of the age requirements and that sort of thing. I want to jump right into the Electoral College first, because this is an idea that really encapsulated what these men thought was important, as we said last night, for our special form of a republic, for our kind of federalism. We wanted representation at the federal level for the people and for the states. And that's why the House was elected by the people and the Senate by the state legislatures until we changed that with the 17th. But the Electoral College was still a way for both the people to have a voice and the states to have a voice. You and I, we get to vote for president, but then our vote is cast with our state. So we get our individual vote within our state, and then our state casts its votes together within the Electoral College. So here's a couple of maps that give you an idea of that. The 2004 election, you see the red states and blue states. That's a breakdown of how the states voted for president. Then the 2008 results. That was actually the first time, by the way, that we had a state split their vote. It was Nebraska. You had actually one district in Nebraska. Maine and Nebraska are the only ones that have it in their state requirements for how they choose their electors. They can actually split their vote. But this was the first time that it happened. One district actually went to President Obama, and all 4 of the other delegates for Nebraska went to John McCain. But what these guys did when they gathered in here, they really had a hard time initially deciding how they wanted to set up the presidency. They looked at a lot of different options. They actually had a committee of 11 guys that debated, okay, should we have, for instance, the Congress choose the president, sort of a parliamentary system like a lot of nations in Europe. They said, no, that's a bad idea because we've seen what happens, and then you kind of hold the president is held to just those folks that elected him out of Congress. He kind of feels like he's beholden to those guys, and they get special favors back and forth. They just didn't like that idea. So they said, well, how about direct election by the people? And they said, no, we don't like that idea because you'll have the most populated areas outvoting the more rural areas, and you'll have regions of the nation going against other regions of the nation. They said, well, why don't we have the states choose? You just have 13 votes and the states choose. They said, no, same problem. You got certain regions of the nation, or you'll have the small states ganging up against the big states. Just won't work. So they came up with a brilliant idea, the Electoral College. They combined all 3 of those things. They said, actually, what we'll do is we'll let the people have a voice, then it'll be within the states, and if no one wins a majority of the Electoral College, then it goes to Congress, and Congress gets to decide at that point, which has actually happened before. Happened with John Quincy Adams, son of John Adams, who was in here for the Declaration. But here's what they really, the concept behind the compromise that they made with those 3 things. They said, we want 2 things to occur. We believe that our executive, our president, should have 2 things. That a president should have a sufficient vote of the people, not necessarily the majority of individual votes, but a sufficient vote, meaning real close, if not the most, and also a sufficient distribution of that vote. So not just have a lot of votes, but have those votes spread across the nation. And that's how the Electoral College sort of encompasses those 2 requirements. And probably the closest thing to that we've seen in our lifetime anyway was, of course, the 2000 race, where you had 2 candidates that got very, very close on the popular vote, on the number of individual votes, with Al Gore edging out George Bush on the number of votes. But they both had a sufficient number of votes. Bush had more of a distribution of votes. If you just look at the map there with the red and the blue, clearly his vote was distributed more across the nation, so he edged out just barely in the Electoral College. That's not the first time. We've had 4 times where the president lost the popular vote but won the Electoral College or was chosen by Congress. So this balance that they gave has actually served us really well. The Electoral College has been a great tool for us as a nation. And I like the way Benjamin Rush describes why they thought it was so important not to have just a popular vote in terms of your big cities being the ones to choose. Because think about it, I mean, if you had just a popular vote and not an Electoral College, who's going to be the major deciders for who's going to be president? Well, your big cities, even in the state. So you're going to have Houston and Philadelphia and Los Angeles and New York, and that's going to be where the vast majority, that's the only places the president's going to campaign. That's going to be where your presidential elections really take place. Here's what Benjamin Rush, now Rush was a great founding father. He's one of the guys that sat here and gave us our Declaration of Independence. He was a medical doctor, trained about 2,000 doctors, just an incredible guy, real Renaissance man, did a lot of amazing things. But I love the way he says this, and you'll just have to forgive the description that he uses. He's a medical doc, all right? And you'll recognize why I'm saying that in a second.
So first, Jefferson writes to Rush and says, I view great cities as pestilential to the morals, the health, and the liberties of man. And then here's Rush's response to Jefferson. He said, I agree with you in your opinion of cities. Cowper the poet very happily expresses our ideas of them compared with the country. Quote, God made the country, man made the cities. I consider them in the same light that I do abscesses on the human body, as reservoirs of all the impurities of a community.
You know, I mean, when you think about that, now I'm a country boy, so I get a good kick out of that, all right? But even if you're a city boy, all right, think about it. What he's saying is, remember, these guys were really into understanding the nature of man, and they understood the depravity of man, that just the nature of man, they're going to do bad things. And if you have a lot of people congregated together, you're going to get more bad things. It's just the nature of man. So they said, we don't want those great cities to be making the decision. We want it to be spread all across the nation. So now, though, there's a movement to reverse what these guys did. It's called the National Popular Vote Movement. And what they're doing is they're using this Article 2, Section 1 language, and you can actually turn to that in page 18 of your Constitution Made Easy. And what they're doing is they're saying, look, it says that any state can choose their electors any way that they want. And you see the language there. Each state shall appoint in such manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors, and goes on to describe. And that's true. The state gets to choose how they're going to choose the electors. I cannot possibly imagine that these men would have ever thought that the choice that a state would make would be to not choose, because that's what National Popular Vote does. If a state adopts National Popular Vote, what they say is, no matter what the people in our state choose, if another candidate gets the popular vote in the nation, our Electoral College votes go to that person. So in other words, if you think back to that map that I showed earlier, if you take my home state of Texas, in the 2008 election went for McCain, but if we had adopted National Popular Vote, our Electoral College votes would have gone to Obama. You think of a state like California that clearly supported President Obama. Their Electoral College had McCain gotten the popular vote, their Electoral College votes would have been taken away from Obama and given to McCain. So it really is, I think, a very bad idea that's going to become very unpopular once it actually kicks in, if it kicks in. And it will kick in once enough states adopt this law that the total of the states that have adopted it is more than 270, because that's the magic number in the Electoral College to win the presidency. So let's look at why they're doing it. This is an assemblyman up in New York. This is actually a Republican assemblyman. He said the Electoral College is an 18th century anachronism that no longer serves the goals of a pure democracy. Do we want a pure democracy? Anybody in here want a pure democracy? Do you think any of these guys wanted a pure democracy? Absolutely not. They were incredibly outspoken against a pure democracy. In fact, that phrase is used by John Witherspoon. I mean, Witherspoon sat here and was a very influential man on the Founding Fathers, gave us the Declaration of Independence, trained a lot of these guys. Witherspoon said this about pure democracy. Pure democracy cannot subsist long, nor be carried far into the Department of State. It is very subject to caprice and the madness of popular rage. The madness of popular rage. Here's John Adams. Remember, democracy never lasts long. It soon wastes, exhausts, and murders itself. There never was a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. And then back to Benjamin Rush. Benjamin Rush says it best. He says, a simple democracy is one of the greatest of evils. A democracy is a mobocracy. They didn't want a democracy. It drives me nuts when a lot of my friends in the political realm talk about, we're for democracy, we want democracy. That word, certainly as understood by these guys, was very different from a republic. They did not want a democracy. In fact, Article 4, Section 4 of our Constitution guarantees we're going to be a republic and that every state is going to be guaranteed to be a republic. Take a look at that slide there. That's the states that have already adopted national popular vote. If you add up their electoral college votes, we're halfway there to getting rid of the electoral college. That's 132. And it's probably going to be adopted by New York. There's several states that are seriously considering it right now. I personally think the momentum is against what I prefer, which is what these guys prefer, the Electoral College. National popular vote is gaining steam in the nation. And the reason, if you think about it, it's actually, the arguments for them are quite simple. Shouldn't the person with the most votes win? And that sounds great if you don't understand federalism, if you don't understand a republic, if you don't understand the idea of the states having a voice and all the things we just talked about with the founders. Unfortunately, in one line, you can tell their side of the story. How long did it take me to go through and explain the value of having an electoral college? So it's harder for us. That's why we have to educate people about what these guys were thinking, what the purpose of the electoral college was, and why it's been good for us as a nation. I do think we can turn the tide on this. I think it's something that just requires education. The fact that we've had 5,000 people go through this class already. I think if we get enough people studying the Constitution and studying the original ideas, we can win that battle, but it's going to take a lot of work. You guys are from all over the country. I challenge you to go home to your state, find out if there's a bill being considered in the legislature to abolish the Electoral College or adopt the national popular vote, and lobby against it. I encourage you to do that and protect the constitutional idea that these guys put into our original document. So that's the Electoral College. You guys got any question on that one before I move on to the next part of the presidency?
This is from Sabrina in Michigan. It's more of a general question, but she asks, well, with the emphasis on the oath of office is huge for the founders, how do we emphasize the importance of the oath of office for the legislature, presidential, and judiciary? How do we enforce or encourage enforcement?
Great question. So a question for Michigan was, if the oath of office was so important to these guys, and they talked about the meaning behind it and why it meant that you were accountable to someone besides those in the room, how do we, I guess if I could rephrase what she said, re-emphasize that today? How do we get back to that idea so that when people take an oath as a legislator, for instance, or as a judge, that they again take that oath very seriously and they are true to that oath? And because if you think about it, if you get elected to the legislature, for instance, most of what you do is not in the public eye. Most votes are not record votes. Most deals, if you will, are made behind the scenes. Most of the activity happens in committee. All that stuff's going on behind the scenes. That's why the founders were so big on the idea that you've got to vote for honest people. You've got to vote for people of integrity that you can trust, because you're not going to be able to hold them accountable in everything that they do. Now, yes, you get that voting record that's on where they do keep the voting record. You can hold them accountable in that way, but it's limited. And so honesty and integrity was a big deal. So if you elect people that are honest and have integrity, then that oath is going to be very important to them. When they take that oath, they're going to want to uphold the Constitution. They're going to want to uphold that oath. And I think the answer to the question is the way you get those running for office to take it seriously when they win is for we the people to demand it of them. Remember what we said about consent of the governed. The only just power of government comes from us.
All right, folks, got to cut it off right there. We're out of time on today's program, but Thursday we'll pick up where we left off today. I'm Rick Green, America's Constitution Coach. You've been listening to At the Core with Walker Wildmon and Rick Green.